This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Turkey has launched an aerial and ground assault on northern Syria, targeting Kurdish-controlled areas. The offensive began Wednesday, just days after President Trump ordered U.S. troops to fall back from their positions on the Turkish-Syrian border. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reports at least 16 Kurds have been killed so far. Turkey is claiming the death toll is far higher. Some of the heaviest fighting has been in the Syrian town of Tel Abyad. Turkish jets and artillery have reportedly hit at least 81 targets east of the Euphrates River. The Trump administration has faced widespread criticism from both Republican and Democratic lawmakers for abandoning the stateless Kurds who'd helped the U.S. fight ISIS. Turkey is claiming the assault is needed to establish a, quote, safe zone in northern Syria, where Turkey could relocate Syrian refugees who fled over the past 8 years of fighting. But the Kurds see the offensive as part of a decades-long attack by Turkey to crush their attempts at greater autonomy.
Fear is also growing that the Turkish assault could lead to the mass release of ISIS fighters. Up until now, the Kurds have been responsible for holding over 10,000 ISIS fighters and their families in detention. While President Trump has claimed Turkey will take control of the makeshift jails, there's growing concern many former ISIS fighters will be able to escape during the Turkish assault. At least one Kurdish prison has already been shelled. The New York Times is reporting the U.S. military has moved as many as several dozen Islamic State prisoners to more secure locations. This includes 2 British members of ISIS who are accused of beheading Western hostages, including the journalists James Foley and Stephen Satloff. The Turkey assault is facing international condemnation. The UN Security Council is expected to meet later today. The European Union has warned Turkey's hostilities would, quote, further undermine the stability of the whole region. Earlier today, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan has threatened to send millions of Syrian refugees to Europe if Turkey's assault is criticized.
Hey Avrupa Birliği!
Hey European Union, pull yourself together. I say it again. If you try to label this operation as an invasion, it's very simple. We will open the gates and send 3.6 million refugees your way.
On Wednesday, President Trump described Turkey's assault as a bad idea, but defended his decision to shift U.S. troops away from the Syrian-Turkish border. Here in New York, protesters demonstrated on Wednesday in front of the offices of Democratic Senators Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand in New York City, demanding the U.S. defend the Kurdish autonomous region known as Rojava. This is Özlem Göner, an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at CUNY, the City University of New York.
Kurds have lost thousands, tens of thousands of lives, their homes, their lands, their agricultural production, so all their livelihood in order to defeat ISIS so that European and US citizens are comfortable in their homes. And now they're once again paying with their lives for having protected our lives.
We're starting right now with 2 guests. In London, we're joined by Elif Sarican, a Kurdish women's movement activist. She's an anthropologist at the London School of Economics. In Brussels, Belgium, we're joined by Ertuğrul Kürkçü, the honorary chair of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, known as the HDP. He's a former member of parliament in Turkey. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Elif Sarican, let's begin with you. Let's start at the beginning, what we understand and what you understand is happening on the ground now. You have this conversation last Sunday between President Trump and the Turkish president, Erdoğan. And apparently, Trump tells him the U.S. will pull troops back in northern Syria. And Erdoğan makes very clear he's going to attack this area with Turkish troops. Explain what has happened since.
I mean, just to give it some context, you know, this is not a new development. Erdoğan has been trying to push for this for many months, if not years, and finally, somehow through quite a mysterious and unclear phone conversation, Trump agreed to withdraw the few US soldiers that were positioned there. And just to make clear that the US Army, the US, Trump himself, the Syrian Democratic Forces and Turkey were well aware that these troops still remained posted there essentially to act as human shields to stop a Turkish invasion. Now, what we saw yesterday was the beginning of this invasion, the long-promised invasion by Turkish President Erdogan. And, you know, as many people have said, as there's a consensus all around the world and with public opinion, is the consequences of this can be grave and will be grave. It's not only that it's essentially threatening a Kurdish genocide, it's not even just a possibility. It will create and cause the resurgence of ISIS. It will add to the international refugee crisis, but also, equally as importantly, it will crush the democratic, ecological and women's liberationist experiment that has been happening there, as well as the Kurds fighting against ISIS.
Elif, the situation is quite extraordinary. A US NATO ally, Turkey, is relentlessly attacking with US-made arms and ammunition, a US ally, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who were also trained and armed by the US. Now, what do you understand is happening today? In these last 2 days, what do we know about casualties, both civilian, Kurdish civilian casualties, as well as casualties among the SDF?
So it's because the situation is unfolding so quickly, it's quite difficult to get any precise figures at this moment. But some of the official figures that we've had in the last 24 hours is that there's over 10 civilians that have been killed. There's at least 15 injured civilians, and also CNN reporter Clarissa Ward was going through part of the region yesterday and reported quite horrific scenes of civilians killed but left on the street because people can't get to them because the shelling is so intense. And in terms of the SDF, again, we don't know the exact figures. We know there's clashes. There's 6 coordinated attacks in 6 border areas of northern Syria, and the Turkish army with its allied jihadi forces don't seem to want to stop by any means.
I wanted to bring Ertuğrul Kürkçü into the conversation and get your response to what President Trump is now just saying. Kurdish forces have fought alongside the U.S. against ISIS for nearly half a decade, nearly 11,000 fighters dead. On Wednesday, Trump criticized the Kurds, saying they didn't help the United States during the Battle of Normandy in World War II. This is Trump speaking to reporters at the White House during an event in the Roosevelt Room.
Now, the Kurds are fighting for their land, just so you understand. They're fighting for their land. And as somebody wrote in a very, very powerful article today, they didn't help us in the Second World War. They didn't help us with Normandy, as an example. They mentioned names of different battles.
And he also said, the Washington Post is reporting the U.S. military has no plans to intervene if Syrian Kurdish forces leave their posts guarding ISIS prisons, raising the question of what will happen to the 11,000 ISIS militants and their families currently detained in some 20 prisons and camps under Kurdish control. So the President Trump was asked about this Wednesday.
ISIS fighters escape and pose a threat elsewhere.
Well, they're going to be escaping to Europe. That's where they want to go. They want to go back to their homes, but Europe didn't want them from us.
Ertuğrul Kürkçü, you're honorary chair of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party. If you could respond to both of these points, that the Kurds didn't help the U.S. at Normandy in World War II, and if the ISIS prisoners get freed, they will go to Europe.
Yeah, this is horrific, not only for the Kurds, but for all the world and for the Americans themselves, that they are governed by the most ignorant person in the world as a statesman. he doesn't even know that the Kurds didn't have a state. They were not a party to the Second World War. They were enslaved by 4 different countries in the Middle East, and he is now speaking about the war in Normandy and why the Kurds weren't there. So he is totally ignorant of the realities of the world order, which was based on the outcome of the Second World War. And secondly, he has no understanding of ISIS and what it means for the civilized world and Middle East and Europe, why ISIS is a problem not only for the United States or Europe, but for the United Nations. ISIS is one of the 2 groups. One is Al-Qaeda and the second one is ISIS, which is pinpointed by the United Nations as the terrorist organizations whom should be stopped by international cooperation, and that's why the United States is having a function in the Middle East. This was not Trump's own idea. What I would like to say that it was the worst idea also by the Obama administration to intervene in the Middle East affairs, to export regime change in Syria, which deeply changed all the course of things in the Middle East and in Syria. And at the middle of the road, the Obama administration changed their course and took the ISIS as the enemy number 1. This was a better understanding of the course of things, but Trump doesn't understand why this was an immense problem for the American interests, as well as the Syrian interests, and as well as the Kurdish interests. So it's a pity that the United States and the world is now is between the lips of an ignorant and reckless person who is the leader of the United States, the number 1 country in the world, which assumes huge responsibilities for the peace in the world, for the stability in the region, and for a world where people will have to live in reconciliation. So now Donald Trump himself may be the biggest problem for the Middle East peace.
And his response, what will happen to ISIS prisoners that escape from prisons, that they'll simply go to Europe?
Actually, the real situation in the field is even more problematic than Donald Trump believes to be. They are not only going to escape to Europe, they are going to operate in Turkey. And until this day, during ISIS massacres, around 200 Turkish people, 99% of whom are government dissidents, have been killed. And today, in a very interesting statement, the Turkish Minister of Domestic Affairs, or the Interior Minister, in response to a question says ISIS doesn't have any other opportunity than to cooperate with us, because they are at loggerheads with all the world, so they should coalesce with us. Now we have a country led by a government an interior minister who believes ISIS will be their ally. So we have done two problems. One is the Turkish official approach to ISIS, a kind of an ally against the Kurds, and the second one is Donald Trump, that ISIS is a European problem, so that Europeans should tackle with the problem. It doesn't mean anything for Donald Trump, but he forgets 9/11, I think. They were in the United States and caused the lives of 3,000 Americans. It's a pity that really this guy is leading the United States where into an abyss, I see.
Our guests are Ertuğrul Kürkçü, the honorary chair of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, joining us from Brussels in Belgium, and Elif Sarican, a Kurdish women's movement activist. Also, Debbie Bukchin is with us in New York, co-founder of the Emergency Committee for Rojava.
I'd like to ask Elif, you said earlier, of course, that there is a real risk of a Kurdish genocide given what's happening. And it's important, I think, to remind people that over 10,000 SDF fighters have died in the fight against ISIS. And the question is now, given this overwhelming Turkish assault in northeast Syria, are the Kurds likely to receive any support from anybody? Some have said that they're likely to be forced to turn to Assad in an attempt to defend themselves against this assault. Could you talk about whether you think that's true and what the implications of that would be for the Kurds?
So, Amy, as you say, there's been 11,000 people martyred in the fight against ISIS. There's 22,000 wounded in this fight, including many international volunteers from the US, from the UK as well, and other countries included. Now, to see what the consequences of a Turkish invasion will be, we don't have to look too far. In January 2018, the Turkish army, again allied with ground jihadi forces, invaded Afrin, causing in a couple of months killing 1,000 people, mostly civilians, causing the displacement of 300,000 people out of a population of 800,000, again, mostly Kurdish people. So even at that time, and now it continues, the Syrian Democratic Council, which is the umbrella formation that also includes the Syrian Democratic Forces, have said they will negotiate and they will sit at a table with any actor in the region to bring about a peaceful solution to the conflict and the situation of the region, and and the effects of it on the wider Middle East and also the world. So this does bring the question of the ultimate aim of all of this needs to be, of course, as we said, the US soldiers were acting as human shields essentially, but that was always going to be a solution that expired. So the solution must be that, and the recognition is that this is in some ways less about the US, but more about the Turkish invasion, if that makes sense. So therefore, the solution must be, whether it's including Syria as well, and Russia and the US, and the actors in the region, including Turkey too. Why not? To be able to come to a political, diplomatic and peaceful solution to the future of the people of Syria in general, which means the Syrian Democratic Council being included in the rewriting of the Syrian constitution and being included in political developments of the region as well. And this is one of the reasons why the situation has got to where it has got to today, because there was a tactical alliance between the US and the Syrian Democratic Forces in the fight against ISIS. But strategically, there was never any political alliances. And this is what needs to be developed right now, because the question isn't, I don't think the question should be whether US soldiers should return there or not. Of course, as a short-term solution, that would push back the invasion and therefore save the lives of millions of people. But ultimately, there needs to be a political solution, and that's what the people of northern Syria and the Syrian Democratic Council have been continue to call for.
Well, Elif, as you know, one of the principal objectives that Erdogan has said for the military invasion is creating a safe zone to which millions of Syrian refugees can be returned. But there have been numerous reports of Turkey recently violently deporting thousands of Syrian refugee men and boys back to Syria. Turkish border guards have reportedly shot and killed Syrians when they tried returning to Turkey to reunite with their families. Now, you've spent time talking to Syrian refugees who've attempted to flee through Turkey. What did the Syrian refugees tell you about how they've been treated by Turkey?
So I was in a refugee camp in Greece in 2016, and I spent a short time with them and talking with them, discussing with them. Most of them at this camp happened to be Kurdish, but there was also Syrian Arabs and other peoples at this camp as well. And it was it was almost every single person we spoke to spoke about the brutality of the Turkish authorities at the border, of when they were trying to cross, the extortion of these people, making confiscating their belongings, their goods, if they had any gold or money on them, to obviously try and live and look after their families. A lot of the time these were confiscated. They reported things like working at some of these, trying to work at local places, and because there was no protection, their wages not being paid, and so therefore shooting refugees trying to flee into Turkey in the first place is not a new thing. Now the forcing of Syrian refugees back into Syria, again, almost entirely is not a voluntary move. So Erdogan declaring at the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 24th of September with a map essentially declaring that he was going to alter the demographic of this region and quote unquote settle his Syrian brothers and sisters in this region is absolutely unprecedented, because often world leaders do not declare beforehand that they're about to commit war crimes. Firstly, a unprovoked attack is obviously by definition, by the UN and Nuremberg principle, a war crime, but also to force the movement of people involuntarily and also to alter the demographic of a region is, again, by definition, ethnic cleansing. And Erdogan declared all of this publicly at the United Nations a few weeks ago. But for some reason, he can do it and get away with it, which to us on the receiving end seems bizarre. But it also seems like he's very, very good, as you've already mentioned today, at blackmailing Europe with the 3.5 million Syrian refugees that he holds in Turkey, unfortunately in very bad conditions. But nonetheless, they're there, and he's somehow preventing them from getting to Europe.